On a quiet afternoon in late June of 1942, Royal Air Force ground crews at Pembrey Airfield in South Wales lifted their binoculars toward a lone silhouette slipping out of a blanket of clouds. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary patrol return, until the shape sharpened into something no one expected. A German fighter was aligning with their runway, calmly, deliberately, as though it belonged there. The alarms never sounded. No anti-aircraft fire erupted. The strange approach was too deliberate to trigger reflexive panic. The Focke-Wulf 190 eased onto the grass, kissed the ground with an absurdly gentle landing, and rolled to a stop beside the control tower. A moment later, the canopy slid back, and a young Luftwaffe officer stepped out, Oberleutnant Armin Faber, a decorated member of Jagdgeschwader 2. He pulled off his leather flight helmet, glanced around, and the color drained from his face. This wasn't France. The fighters parked nearby were not Messerschmitts. The airmen sprinting toward him wore Royal Air Force blue. And in that frozen instant, Faber understood the scale of his mistake. At the exact same moment, British intelligence officers across the region realized the unimaginable. The most feared German fighter in the war had just been handed to them in perfect condition, by accident. For nearly a year, this mysterious new machine had carved a deadly path across the Channel. The Focke-Wulf 190 appeared over France in the autumn of 1941 and instantly stunned the Allies. From the first dogfight, it became clear that the RAF was facing something beyond anything they had trained for. Squadron leader James Edgar Johnson, who would eventually become Britain's top ace, barely escaped his first encounter with it. He wrote later that the 190 could outrun the Spitfire Mark V in level flight, plummet faster in a dive, and roll so violently that British fighters simply couldn't match its movements. Its guns tore fighters apart in seconds. For the first time since the war began, Allied pilots were being decisively outperformed. Losses over occupied France climbed sharply through early 1942. Veterans who had survived the Battle of Britain were falling to an aircraft they could neither outrun nor outmaneuver. American pilots arriving with their new Thunderbolts were warned repeatedly, avoid a rolling fight, avoid a turning fight, avoid trying to follow it into a dive. The list of what not to do stretched on and on. To counter the threat, Allied analysts needed data, real, detailed, technical answers. But every German wreck that crashed on British soil was too mangled to offer clues. The 190 remained untouchable, undefeated, and largely unknown. Until Armin Faber misread the coast. Despite his youth, Faber wasn't an amateur. He already had victories to his name and flew among Germany's best. On that June day, his unit had been escorting bombers over the Channel. Somewhere in the chaos of weaving through Spitfires, with clouds swallowing the sky and the sun distorting direction, he lost track of his heading. A single disorienting turn shifted his orientation, and he never realized he'd flown the wrong way. He broke out of the cloud layer expecting to see friendly territory beneath him. Instead, he was staring at Wales, and the Royal Air Force was staring back. Faber tried to restart his engine, desperate to escape, but it was too late. Armed guards surrounded him before the propeller even spun. Within minutes, intelligence teams were swarming the unscathed treasure sitting on the runway, a flawless Focke-Wulf 190A series fighter. At RAF headquarters, the atmosphere bordered on celebration. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas ordered the aircraft to be transported immediately to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Every inch of it was to be inspected, measured, and flown. 2 days later, British engineers began peeling back the secrets that had terrorized Allied pilots for months. What they found was an engineering philosophy entirely different from that of the Spitfire. Where the British fighter embodied refinement, the 190 showcased raw practicality. It carried a brutish BMW radial engine generating roughly 1,700 horsepower, far more than a Spitfire Mark V's power plant. But numbers alone didn't explain its dominance. The 190 possessed the most stunning roll rate any Allied pilot had ever seen. It could snap from one wingtip to the other in an instant, giving German pilots the ability to reverse direction, break pursuit, and unleash fire before a Spitfire pilot even began his turn. Test pilot Captain Erich Brown flew the captured machine and immediately understood the disaster unfolding over France. He wrote that the controls were feather-light, almost telepathic. You didn't fight the aircraft, you merely thought, and it moved. Its firepower was equally brutal, 420mm cannons and 2 machine guns delivering enough explosive force in a 2-second burst to shred a Spitfire frame. The dive problem finally made sense, too. The 190's clean aerodynamics and weight meant it dropped faster than anything the Allies fielded. A Spitfire chasing it downward was like a lion pursuing a falling stone. But inside this monster were weaknesses, vulnerabilities that Allied engineers quickly realized could shift the air war. Above 20,000 feet, the radial engine lost breathing power. Cooling issues emerged. Control surfaces stiffened at very high speeds. The aircraft felt heavy in prolonged turns. These discoveries were not curiosities. They were strategic gold. Within days, the RAF began distributing confidential bulletins to fighter squadrons. New tactics were written. New maneuvers were taught. And soon, American engineers, eager to build fighters capable of surviving these monsters, would take those findings even further. Before we move on, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you knew how close the Allies came to disaster before a single wrong turn changed everything. If you love deep-dive aviation stories like this one, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter. The British didn't simply test the captured fighter themselves. They opened the doors of Farnborough to American pilots, giving them access to the machine that had terrorized their future air war. In the late summer of 1942, a group of United States Army Air Force's test officers arrived eager to inspect the prize the RAF had secured. What they learned in those hangars would later keep hundreds of American aviators alive. Major Cass Hoff, among the first Americans to strap into the cockpit, later wrote an extensive assessment that circulated through nearly every fighter group preparing to cross the Atlantic. His report didn't bother with diplomacy. It was a tactical warning, stripped of emotion. According to him, a well-handled Focke-Wulf would dominate any Allied aircraft at low or medium altitudes. The German pilot who kept the fight beneath 20,000 feet would usually control the engagement. Hoff emphasized a simple truth. American pilots needed to own the sky above the enemy. The Thunderbolt and the newer Spitfires thrived high in the thin air. Force the German aircraft upward, and the advantage flipped. Allow them to dictate a low-level brawl, and Allied fighters would bleed for it. This single insight rewired American doctrine. When Thunderbolt units began combat operations the following year, their strategy centered on altitude supremacy. Bomber escorts climbed as high as their engines would carry them. Fighter sweeps operated far above the cloud tops. When German fighters darted upward to attack the bombers, American pilots maintained the high ground, dragging their opponents into the altitude band where the Focke-Wulf struggled. It marked the beginning of a new way of fighting. The captured fighter didn't just reshape tactics, it shifted the very blueprint of American aircraft. Engineers at Wright Field dissected the German plane's astonishing roll authority and began revising the control surfaces of the P-47 and P-51 to mimic that responsiveness. They noted how the Focke-Wulf grouped its armament for maximum effect and how its cockpit layout prioritized clarity and ease of use. Those ideas began echoing through American design philosophy. But perhaps the most vital revelation wasn't technical. It was psychological. The mystique surrounding the German fighter evaporated. The fear that had crept into Allied squadrons after months of losses began to break. The aircraft that had seemed untouchable suddenly looked mortal. Powerful, yes, but vulnerable when engaged properly. By the final months of 1943, that shift was visible across the front. Thunderbolts and Mustangs were now hunting Focke-Wulfs at the altitudes where Allied machines excelled. The upgraded Spitfire Mark IX finally matched the German fighter in most regimes. The kill ratios began tilting toward the Allies, and they stayed there. German aces noticed the change immediately. Oberleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected experts on the Focke-Wulf, observed that American pilots were no longer making the elementary errors that had cost them so many lives earlier in the war. They refused to follow his aircraft into rolling maneuvers. They pulled the fight upward, deliberately exploiting German weaknesses. As he wrote in his logbook, the enemy had studied the aircraft just as thoroughly as its own designers. Throughout the conflict, the captured fighter remained at Farnborough as a reference machine. Each time Germany introduced a new variant, Allied analysts compared it to the specimen delivered by accident. That allowed intelligence officials to instantly identify design changes, mechanical improvements, and attempts to overcome previous shortcomings. When the long-nosed D-series appeared in the closing stages of the war, the Allies already understood what Germany was trying to fix, and where new pressure points would emerge. Decades later, military historians attempted to calculate the real impact of Faber's navigational error. The truth was astonishing. Insights gathered from that single undamaged aircraft were copied into briefings, films, manuals, and in-person demonstrations for countless pilots. The information reshaped strategy, influenced the evolution of both the Thunderbolt and the Mustang, and accelerated improvements in Allied pilot training. Captain Eric Brown, who evaluated more captured enemy aircraft than any Allied pilot, would later compare Faber's blunder to discovering a key that unlocked the entire logic of German fighter design. Every edge the Focke-Wulf possessed was identified with precision. Every flaw was documented. And each of those flaws became an opportunity. The Luftwaffe later acknowledged the mistake with grim disbelief. Their own intelligence units had spent months trying to secure an intact Spitfire for analysis. Meanwhile, the British received Germany's finest frontline fighter without lifting a finger. Faber himself spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in Canada, surviving the conflict and living quietly afterward. Records show he was initially criticized for the loss, though later evaluations recognized that combat disorientation could afflict even the most experienced pilots. The true lesson that emerges from this episode reaches far beyond a single aircraft. When the Focke-Wulf 190 first appeared, it represented a breathtaking leap in fighter design, a machine that outclassed its rivals with ease. Yet its supremacy lasted only until the moment Allied engineers could study the real thing. Every fighter, no matter how advanced, represents a mixture of strengths and concessions. Its dominance exists only as long as those compromises remain unknown. The German aircraft's fierce performance at low altitude meant sacrifices elsewhere. Its legendary roll rate brought heavy control forces at extreme speed. Its firepower added weight that narrowed its turning ability. Once those realities were exposed, Allied tactics adapted, and the fighter that once felt unstoppable became just another machine with exploitable seams.